Rome gave the world roads, concrete, and the legal system, then handed unlimited power to a parade of young men with no rules, no therapists, and an army that did whatever they said. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot, as it turns out. And these are the emperors who proved it. Caligula versus the ocean. Let us start with the gold standard of imperial chaos. Gaius Caesar is better known by his childhood army nickname, Caligula, which means little boots, because as a toddler he wandered around his father's military camp in a tiny soldier's uniform. He hated the name. He would grow up to earn much worse ones. The young Caligula actually started out wildly popular, the beloved son of a war hero, cheered through the streets when he took power in 37 AD. Then, a few months in, he fell seriously ill and nearly died. Whatever happened in that sickbed, the man who walked out of it was a different animal. His favorite saying, lifted from an old tragedy, was reportedly that people could hate him all they wanted, so long as they feared him. He spent the next 4 years making very sure they did. The story everyone tells is the seashells. According to the biographer Suetonius, Caligula marched an entire army all the way to the Channel coast, lined them up as if to invade Britain, and then, instead of attacking, ordered his soldiers to gather seashells and stuff their helmets with what he called the spoils of the ocean. A whole military campaign, reduced to the world's most expensive day at the beach. Historians argue about what actually happened. Some think it was a garbled punishment for mutinous troops. Others suspect a single word got mistranslated, but at the very least it tells you how his own people chose to remember him. And no, despite what you may have heard, he did not declare war on the sea god Neptune. That detail comes from a 20th century novel, not from any Roman. What he definitely did was decide he was a god. He set up a temple to himself, complete with priests and a life-sized golden statue that was dressed each morning to match whatever he was wearing that day. He liked to stand between statues of the gods so the public could worship him in person. On bright nights, he reportedly invited the moon to come down and share his bed, and he held long private conversations with the statue of Jupiter. When a crowd cheered for the wrong chariot team, he supposedly snapped that he wished the Roman people had a single neck, so he could cut through all of them at once. And then there is the horse. You have almost certainly heard that Caligula made his favorite racehorse, Incitatus, a consul, one of the highest offices in all of Rome. The truth is a little sharper than that. Incitatus really was pampered beyond all reason, with a marble stall, an ivory manger, a jeweled collar, and a personal staff of servants, and Caligula reportedly invited the animal to formal dinners and toasted its health. But the sources only say he planned or joked about handing the horse a consulship, and even they hedge on whether he was serious. Most historians now read the whole thing as a calculated insult to the Senate, a way of sneering that a horse could do their jobs just as well as they could, which is somehow more savage than if he had actually meant it. He also built one of the great pointless monuments of the ancient world. An astrologer had once told the old emperor that Caligula had no more chance of becoming ruler than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. So Caligula became emperor, then built a 2.5-mile bridge of boats across that exact bay, and spent 2 days riding back and forth over it in a golden cloak, purely to prove a fortune-teller wrong. That is pettiness on an imperial budget. The cruelty was not all theater either. He is said to have forced fathers to attend the executions of their own sons, ordered a writer burned alive over a pun he took the wrong way, and reminded a dinner guest, with a smile, that he could have him killed on the spot for absolutely any reason. Even allowing for the bias of his enemies, the consistent picture is a young man who had just discovered there was nothing, and nobody, he was not allowed to touch. It ended the way these stories tend to. In 41 AD, an officer of his own guard named Cassius Chaerea, a man Caligula loved to mock for having a high voice, cornered him in a palace corridor and cut him down. 4 years of terror, finished off by a bruised ego and a sharp sword. Who wrote this down? Before we go further, a quick warning label, because it actually makes the rest of this list smarter. Almost everything we know about these men comes from a small group of writers who could not stand them. Suetonius wrote his gossipy biographies decades after the events. Cassius Dio, a senator, wrote more than a century later and was often nowhere near the action. And the worst offender, a collection called the Historia Augusta, was put together by an anonymous author so fond of inventing things that scholars basically treat him as a novelist, complete with fake documents and quotes he made up out of thin air. These were wealthy, upper-class men writing about emperors who had taxed them, ignored them, executed them, or simply stolen their spotlight. Not exactly an unbiased jury, so a lot of the wildest tales are part rumor, part character assassination, and part ancient tabloid. Mary Beard, one of the sharpest historians of Rome alive, points out that some of the dirt does not even survive a careful read. The famous claim that Caligula slept with his sisters, for example, may rest partly on a mistranslation about who was seated where at dinner. Here is the part that keeps it fun though. Even after you scrub out the nonsense, plenty is left standing, and a surprising amount of it is backed by hard evidence, by statues, coins, and ruins you can still walk through today. These men were not innocent. The camera was just held by their enemies. Keep that in your back pocket, and let us meet the rest of the cast. Nero kills the family. If Caligula was pure chaos, Nero was a soap opera with a body count. He became emperor at 16, with his scheming mother Agrippina pulling most of the strings. Agrippina had clawed her own way to the top, very possibly poisoning her husband, the emperor Claudius, to put her boy on the throne. Nero thanked her by deciding she had to go. The plot that follows is almost too theatrical to be real, and parts of it surely are exaggerated, but the core holds up. He had a special boat built that was designed to fall apart at sea and drown her quietly. The boat collapsed right on schedule. Agrippina, inconveniently, could swim, and paddled calmly to shore. So Nero dropped the clever plan and just sent soldiers to stab her. According to the story, she told them to strike her in the belly, the womb that had produced such a son, and that was only the grand finale. Earlier on, Nero had reportedly tried to poison his mother 3 separate times, and failed every time because the famously paranoid Agrippina had spent years quietly dosing herself with small amounts of poison to build up immunity for exactly this sort of family occasion. He even rigged a ceiling above her bed to collapse on her while she slept, only for someone to tip her off in advance. Killing Agrippina turned out to be less of a crime and more of an engineering problem. His love life was no gentler. He is said to have killed his pregnant wife Poppaea with a kick to the stomach during an argument, though plenty of historians suspect she actually died from complications in pregnancy, and the kick is the lurid version. Then there was Sporus, a young man who reportedly bore a striking resemblance to the dead Poppaea. Nero had him castrated, dressed him as an empress, and married him in a full public ceremony. In a separate wedding, Nero married a freedman named Pythagoras, and played the role of the bride himself. Roman high society simply did not know where to look, and the thing he cared about most in all the world, not war, not law, his singing. Nero was convinced he was a great artist, performed on stage for hours at a stretch, and entered himself into Greek competitions. The problem was that nobody was allowed to leave during his performances. The guards locked the exits. Writers claim women gave birth in the seats, and grown men faked their own deaths just to be carried out. Being a fan was both mandatory and exhausting. When he toured the games in Greece, the contests were quietly fixed so that he won every event he entered, hauling home well over 1,000 victory crowns, including a prize for a chariot race he did not even finish, having tumbled out of the chariot partway through. Rome burns, Nero sings. Which brings us to the big one. In July of 64 AD, a fire broke out near the Circus Maximus and tore through Rome for days, gutting most of the city. You have heard that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. 2 problems with that. The fiddle would not be invented for roughly another 1,500 years, and Nero was not even in the city. Our best source, the historian Tacitus, says Nero was at his villa in Antium, about 35 miles away, and that he hurried back, organized relief efforts, and threw open his own gardens to shelter the homeless. There was a rumor floating around that he sang about the fall of Troy while watching the flames, but even Tacitus reports that as gossip, not fact. Here is where Nero genuinely earns his place though. When people began muttering that he had started the fire himself to clear space for building projects, he needed a scapegoat fast, and he chose the strange new religious group called Christians. What he did next was monstrous, and it comes from a reliable source. Tacitus describes Christians wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, nailed to crosses, and set alight to serve as human lamps in Nero's gardens after dark, while the emperor strolled among the crowd dressed as a charioteer. And what did he build on top of the ashes? A palace for himself. The Golden House, the Domus Aurea, sprawled across the burned heart of the city, complete with a dining room that may genuinely have rotated and a private artificial lake. Suetonius claims that when Nero finally moved into the finished palace, he sighed with satisfaction that he could at last begin to live in a style fit for a human being. Right beside the palace stood a bronze statue of Nero, around 30 meters tall. That giant statue, the Colossus, is very likely where the Colosseum, built later on the drained lake, got its nickname. The man's ego is literally baked into the most famous building in Rome. Nero's run ended in 68 AD, when the army and the Senate turned on him and branded him a public enemy. Cornered and out of options, he had a servant help him take his own life, reportedly sighing that what an artist the world was losing in him. And the strangest twist of all? The common people had actually adored him. For years afterward, imposters kept popping up around the empire, claiming to be Nero, returned from the dead, and crowds genuinely believed them. Commodus plays Hercules. Marcus Aurelius was the wise philosopher emperor, about the closest Rome ever came to putting a saint on the throne. His son Commodus was the universe's idea of a punchline. While the empire was still reeling from a deadly plague, Commodus decided his true calling was the arena. Emperors were supposed to watch the games from a safe, dignified distance. Commodus jumped straight into the sand and fought as a gladiator, hundreds of times by some accounts, though that particular number comes from our least trustworthy source. The fights were rigged, obviously. His opponents understood that wounding the emperor was a very fast way to die, so they yielded. He also charged the city a fortune for every appearance, around 1,000,000 coins a time, while real gladiators fought for scraps. To give you a sense of the obsession, the shakier sources put his total arena appearances at 735, and while that exact figure is not to be trusted, the mania behind it absolutely was. He turned the slaughter of exotic animals into a personal pastime, reportedly killing lions, leopards, elephants, and even a giraffe, a creature most Romans had never laid eyes on, in front of stunned crowds. The grim joke is the timing. All of this preening played out during the Antonine Plague, a brutal epidemic that was busy carrying off a huge share of the empire, while its ruler practiced trick archery on terrified ostriches. He loved to dress up as the demigod Hercules, draping himself in a lion skin and lugging around a giant club. And we do not just have to take the writer's word for this, because statues of Commodus posing as Hercules survive to this day. He ordered everyone to address him as the son of Zeus. He renamed the entire city of Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana, then renamed all 12 months of the year after his own names and titles, because apparently nobody could stop him. The arena stunts turned genuinely dark. The historian Cassius Dio, who was actually in the stands, describes Commodus shooting the heads clean off running ostriches with crescent-bladed arrows, then strolling over to the senators, holding up a severed ostrich head, and grinning, as if to promise they were next. Dio admits the terrified senators had to chew the laurel leaves out of their wreaths to stop themselves from laughing and getting executed for it. It all ended on the final day of 192 AD. His own inner circle, including his mistress, tried to poison him. When he threw the poison back up, they sent in his personal wrestling partner, a man named Narcissus, who strangled the emperor in his own bath. If this is ringing a bell, it is roughly the plot of the film Gladiator, which keeps the arena and the strangling, and cheerfully invents almost everything else. The boy priest emperor. Now for the teenager. Elagabalus became emperor at around 14 and was dead by 18, and he managed to pack an astonishing amount of scandal into those 4 years. He owed his crown to his sharp grandmother, Julia Maesa, who spread a rumor that the boy was the secret son of a beloved past emperor and bribed the army into backing him. She would later help engineer his downfall too, quietly swapping him out for his more manageable cousin once the teenager became too much of an embarrassment to defend. He came from Syria, where he served as the hereditary priest of a sun god named Elagabal, worshipped in the form of a large black cone-shaped meteorite. When he took the throne, he brought the rock with him. He paraded the sacred stone into Rome on a jeweled chariot, built it a grand temple, and tried to rank his desert sun god above Jupiter himself, the king of the entire Roman pantheon. The establishment was horrified, and this part is not just gossip, because the meteorite shows up right there on his official coins. He threw himself into the role of high priest with total commitment. He led wild public ceremonies for his sun god, dancing backward around the altars to clashing music and clouds of incense, and reportedly forced Rome's most senior officials to take part in rites for a foreign deity they neither understood nor wanted. For the old Roman families, watching their dignified state religion get shoved aside for a teenager and his glittering rock was a slow-motion nightmare in real time. Then he married a Vestal virgin. The Vestals were Rome's holiest priestesses, sworn to absolute chastity on penalty of being buried alive. Elagabalus married one named Aquilia Severa anyway, announced that their union would produce godlike children, divorced her, and then later married her all over again. To Romans, this was not a love story, it was sacrilege with a wedding cake. A lot of what comes next is from that unreliable novelist of a historian, so handle with care. He is said to have smothered dinner guests to death by dumping tons of rose petals on them from a false ceiling, which is almost certainly invented and physically ridiculous, though it did inspire a gorgeous Victorian painting. He supposedly seated guests on cushions that secretly deflated mid-meal, an ancient whoopee cushion, and turned tamed lions loose at dinner to terrify everyone present. One thread deserves real care. The contemporary writer Cassius Dio claims Elagabalus wore makeup and wigs, preferred to be called lady rather than lord, called a male charioteer his husband, and even offered doctors a fortune to surgically give him a woman's body. Some modern voices read this as an early trans story. Many serious historians push back hard, noting that Dio was hostile, far from Rome, and using effeminacy as a weapon, which was the standard Roman way to smear an enemy. The honest answer is that we simply cannot trust one furious source to tell us the truth about anyone's most private self. What we do know is how it ended. At 18, the guard turned on him, killed him alongside his own mother, and dragged their bodies through the streets before tossing him into the river Tiber. Brother, meet the sword. Some emperors needed years to earn a place on a list this unhinged. Caracalla managed it in a single afternoon. He was supposed to share the throne with his younger brother Geta. The two of them hated each other so thoroughly that they reportedly discussed splitting the entire empire in half just to avoid being in the same room. Instead, Caracalla arranged a peace meeting in their mother's apartments, then had his soldiers burst in and cut Geta down. Geta died bleeding in the arms of their mother, Julia Domna, who was herself wounded trying to shield her son. Caracalla then ordered Geta erased from history, scrubbing his face off paintings and chiseling his name off monuments, a punishment the Romans called damnatio memoria. A few years later, the people of Alexandria made the fatal mistake of mocking him with a bit of street theater about the murder. Caracalla invited the city's young men to assemble, supposedly so he could honor them, then turned his troops loose on the crowd. Cassius Dio says more than 20,000 people were slaughtered. He wiped out a chunk of a city over a joke. The strangest detail is what he did in between the atrocities. Caracalla was obsessed with Alexander the Great, who had been dead for more than 500 years. He dressed as Alexander, copied his poses and portraits, made a pilgrimage to his tomb, and raised a special unit of soldiers he proudly called his Alexander Phalanx, a man who murdered his own brother, happily playing dress-up as his childhood hero. For all that blood, Caracalla left two giant marks on history that had nothing to do with killing. He issued an edict granting Roman citizenship to nearly every free man in the empire, a genuinely enormous change that rewrote what it even meant to be Roman. And he built the Baths of Caracalla, a public leisure complex so colossal that its surviving ruins still stop tourists dead in their tracks today. Even the monsters, now and then, manage to leave something standing: flies, feasts, and a chicken. Not every imperial weirdo gets a blockbuster. Some of them just get a strange little habit. Take Domitian. Before he grew into a paranoid, murderous emperor, the young Domitian spent hours alone every single day doing exactly one thing: catching flies and stabbing them, one by one, with a sharpened pen. The habit was so well known that when a visitor asked whether anyone was with the emperor, a courtier reportedly answered, "Not even a fly." He also gets blamed for the so-called Black Banquet, where he invited a group of nobles into a pitch-black room done up as a tomb, sat each one beside a gravestone carved with that guest's own name, and had naked boys painted black serve the food, letting every guest assume he was the dinner. That tale comes from a single source written long after the fact, so season it with salt, but it certainly fits the man. As his reign went on, Domitian grew so afraid of assassination that he reportedly had the walls of his palace walkways lined with polished, mirror-bright stone, so he could always see what was happening behind him. Given how many Roman emperors got stabbed by people they trusted, that might honestly be the single sanest decision on this entire list. Then step back to Tiberius, the emperor who basically quit. He walked away from Rome entirely, moved to the island of Capri, and let a scheming deputy run a reign of terror in his name. The lurid stories about what he supposedly got up to on that island are almost certainly hostile invention, but the plain fact underneath is somehow even stranger. The most powerful man on earth looked at his own job and decided he would rather retire to a cliffside villa and never come back. The deputy he left running the city, a ruthless guard commander named Sejanus, used that vacuum to purge his rivals and terrorize Rome, right up until Tiberius abruptly decided Sejanus was a threat and had him torn down too. Ruling the known world by remote control, it turns out, has its downsides. And finally, the gentle disaster at the very end of the empire. By 410 AD, Rome was a faded shadow of itself, and the emperor Honorius was hiding out in the swamp city of Ravenna, far more interested in his prize chickens than his crumbling realm. When a messenger rushed in and cried that Rome had perished, Honorius was devastated, because he happened to own a beloved pet hen named Roma. Once it was gently explained that no, it was only the actual city of Rome that had just fallen to the barbarians, he relaxed, relieved that his bird was fine. The story is probably too perfect to be true, written about a century later, but it captures the mood of an empire being steered by a man whose priorities were, shall we say, foul. So, were they actually mad? So were these men genuinely insane, or just spectacularly badly reviewed? The honest answer is a bit of both, and that is exactly what makes them fascinating. Strip away the propaganda, and you are still left with real cruelty, real megalomania, and real corpses. The Golden House was real. The Hercules statues are real. The murdered brother and the burning Christians are horribly real. These were not gentle souls slandered by gossip columnists. They did genuinely terrible things. But you always have to remember who was holding the pen. The writers preserving this history belonged to the same class the emperors had humiliated, taxed, and killed. And they had every reason on earth to turn flawed, frightening men into cartoon monsters. As Mary Beard likes to note, even if every single story were true, it barely changed how the vast machine of the empire actually ran from one day to the next. The roads still got built, the taxes still got collected. The madness at the top was loud, but the base just kept grinding along beneath it. So take your pick. The god who waged war on the tide and lost to a bridge of boats. The artist who torched his own fans and got a stadium named after his ego. The teenager who married a meteorite and a Vestal Virgin in the same breath. Rome handed total power, a full treasury, and zero consequences to one young man after another. Then acted genuinely shocked when one of them wandered off to have a chat with the moon. 2,000 years later, we are still telling their stories, which, for a pack of attention-starved megalomaniacs, might be the only thing they ever truly wanted.